Where two or three are gathered in my name, there am I in the midst of them. In that good old pre-pandemic days, that seems years ago now, doesn't it? But nonetheless, in those good old days of the pre-pandemic, there were moments, occasions, opportunities where people who were celebrating a milestone in their life, maybe a significant birthday or a significant anniversary, would take the opportunity, they and their families, to have a party, perhaps have an open house for a wedding anniversary, whatever the occasion and the event might require. It seems as though, at least for the present moment, those kinds of opportunities and occasions and events seem to be like permanently put on hold. But I can still remember in those good old pre-pandemic days going to just such an event. It was a 60th wedding anniversary, and the couple, of course, were still madly in love with one another after all those years, imagine. But there they were, they had an open house, their children did, for these two now elderly people. And they stood in line and greeted friends, neighbors, of course, family members, relatives, and of course, their parish priest. And as I went up to them to congratulate them, this was years ago now, on their 60th wedding anniversary, I, of course, took the opportunity to shake their hands. Seems like that's gone now forever as well. But nonetheless, as I greeted them and congratulated them, I asked them, what's the secret to your success? What's the secret to 60 years of marriage? How is it that the two of you have gotten to this moment, at this point in time in your life? And the husband, kind of a prankster himself, looked at me with a smile on his face and a twinkle in his eye. And he said two things, Father Steve. Number one, I've learned I should never speak on behalf of my wife. And I haven't done that, he said, for the last, God knows, 40-some years. Took me 20 years, though, he said, to figure that out. But I never speak on her behalf. That's the first secret. Second one, he said, this too took me many, many years to figure out. But eventually, he said, I realized one morning, as her and I were lying in bed, she sound asleep, but I, having tossed and turned most of the night because of an argument that the two of us had got into the night before. And as I looked at this incredible, beautiful wife of mine, lying there sound asleep, he said, I came to realize this second secret, truth, to what became the success to our marriage. And that was this. I want to be married more than I want to be right. I want to be married more than I want to be right. It's amazing, isn't it? What a great insight to come to that realization that he wanted to choose a relationship over choosing to be right. Oh, if all of us could eventually get to that truth and embrace that insight each and every day of our lives. Because isn't that the reason why you and I struggle to do what Jesus invites us to do in the gospel for this Sunday? Why reconciliation and forgiveness is so incredibly difficult? Why it's so difficult for you and I to go directly to the person who has offended us or whom we have offended, and for them to come directly to us and one-on-one for you and I to sit down and have a conversation and to be able to seek reconciliation and forgiveness in this relationship? Why is it so difficult for you and I to do that? Well, because every time you and I have a conflict with someone, you and I hate trying to go about resolving it. Why? Because we have already convinced ourselves that in order for this to happen, in order for the resolution to the conflict to take place, I need to prove to this person that I'm right, which means they have to be wrong. That I'm going to win, which means they have to lose. And my friends, that's why we despise conflict resolution. Because we're competitive by nature. why we came into this world kicking and screaming, survival of the fittest, why it is about being right and it's about winning. My friends, that works maybe in the business world and on a football field or a soccer field or a wrestling match, wherever sport we might be playing. But anytime you and I choose to bring that into relationships, being right so that somebody has to be wrong, winning so that somebody has to lose, well then chances are in the long run, we all lose. That's why Paul says to us in today's second reading, love is the fulfillment of the law. Love is the fulfillment of the law. When we love our neighbor, when we strive to recognize, as this elderly man did at some point in time in the marriage, that he wanted to be married more than he wanted to be right, why, the great insight in that is what? That he finally realized the truth, that where two or three are gathered in my name, there am I in the midst of them. Notice Jesus doesn't say, I'm going to be with this person or that person because they're right and that person is wrong. No, Jesus says at the end of today's gospel, there am I in the midst of them. How hard it is for you and I to believe that God is actively present in our everyday lives wherever two or three people are gathered. That God isn't just out there, up there, or in the Blessed Sacrament tabernacle, but that God chooses to dwell wherever two or three people gather in his name. There am I in the midst of them. And that was the beautiful insight of that elderly man, because he recognized that God chooses to dwell in the midst of every married couple because there are two there. And in the midst of them, there God chooses to dwell. Where reconciliation and forgiveness oftentimes needs to be the work of the day, that is part of being a husband or a wife. It's also part of being a friend. It's also part of being a family member. It's also part of being a sibling. It's whatever relationship we find ourselves in. Can you and I have the insight and the ability to say, I would rather be a friend than be right. I would rather be married than be right. I would rather be a member of this world rather than having to be right, rather than having to be Democrat, rather than having to be Republican, or whatever it is that we might call ourselves. My friends, all of that is insignificant when it comes to love, which is the fulfillment of the law. So let us come today, we who receive once again God's forgiveness, God's grace, God's mercy, and God's presence, because we are more than two or three gathered here in his name, and he is here in the midst of us, and he invites us to recognize that it's better to welcome a relationship, to welcome Christ in our midst whenever we gather with another or two or three or however many we gather, whether we can do it now in post-pandemic days or not. Whenever we gather, God is in the midst of us. So let us welcome him. Let us choose to fulfill the law. Let us love.